The village of Black Hollow was built on the bones of the sea. It was a place where the wind howled through rotting wooden docks, and the tides churned with something darker than water. The fishermen who lived there were hardened men, their faces lined with salt and stories of the deep. But now, one by one, they were disappearing. No bodies, no wrecked boats, just empty, rocking vessels washing ashore at dawn. Jonas Hale arrived under the weight of an angry storm. He was no stranger to death. A former investigator of the occult, he had spent years chasing myths, unearthing truths that most men wished to keep buried. He had seen things that clawed at sanity, things that fed on darkness. And now, he had been called here, by a desperate, whispering letter from an old friend who had vanished before Jonas could even reply. His arrival was met with silence. No welcoming voices, no curious eyes. The village looked abandoned, but he knew better. Someone was watching. He felt their gaze slither over his back as he trudged through the mud toward the only building with any light, the tavern. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and old sweat. A few fishermen sat hunched over their drinks, their eyes darting toward him but never meeting his gaze. The barkeep, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks, watched Jonas approach but said nothing. "I'm looking for William Carter," Jonas said, shaking the rain from his coat. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "Will's gone," the barkeep muttered finally, not looking up. Like the rest, Jonas felt something twist in his stomach. "Tell me what happened." One of the fishermen, a man with a beard like tangled rope, let out a bitter laugh. "You don't want to know." Jonas pulled out the letter, sliding it onto the bar. "I think I do." The barkeep's eyes flickered toward it, and for a moment, something dark and fearful passed across his face. Then he leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "They say it comes from the deep," he murmured. "It doesn't leave marks, doesn't leave blood, just takes." Jonas felt the air grow colder, as if the thing they spoke of had slithered into the room unseen. "What is it?" No one answered. The men around him sat still as stone, their faces carved with fear. Then, from outside, something screeched. Not human, not animal. A noise like metal scraping against bone, high and wet and wrong. The tavern went deathly still. The fishermen's hands gripped their glasses so tight their knuckles went white. Jonas turned toward the door, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. And then, the sound came again. Closer. Something was out there. Something knew he had arrived. The tavern was in thick silence, but something was moving outside. Jonas could hear something dragging on the wet ground, something breathing in heavy, unnatural gusts. Then there was a slow, deliberate knock on the wooden door. 3 times. The fishermen didn't move. Their faces were pale, their eyes glued to their drinks, as if ignoring the sound would make it disappear. Jonas was not the type to sit still and wait for nightmares to come to him. He reached for the knife in his coat and took a step toward the door. "Don't," the bartender hissed under his breath. Jonas ignored him. He opened the door with a slight creak. There was nothing. The night outside was thick with fog that rolled off the water like clenched fingers. The pier creaked under the weight of the storm. The wind smelled like rot. Then his eyes caught sight of something. Footprints. A trail of wet, black prints led from the shore to the tavern entrance, pooling in a thick, tar-like puddle where something had stood a moment before. But there were no footprints in the prints. Each footprint looked more like a smear, the imprint of something that had pulled itself out of the sea. Jonas's breathing became slow and steady. He had seen things before that shouldn't have existed, but this, something was watching him. He could feel it. Then, down by the shore, he heard something sliding. It was not the wind. It was not the sea. It was closer. A figure was moving in the fog, low and shifting, its edges too fluid to be human. Jonas could see something wet, something shiny, something too long to be on 2 legs. It slid across the wooden dock without a sound. Its shape deformed as if it were still semi-liquid, its form barely holding together. Jonas's pulse quickened, and then it turned toward him, and in the swirling black of his form, something opened. Not eyes, a mouth. Jonas slammed the door. Something hit the wood on the other side. The fishermen jumped at the sound, horror on their faces. The bartender moved quickly, throwing open the heavy iron latch. Then a voice whispered from the other side of the door. Not a human voice. Not real. But he knew his name. Jonas. Hail. The whisper slipped through the cracks like oil, thick and wet. Jonas stepped back, gripping the knife tighter. What is it? He hissed. No one answered. Then, the door burst open, and the candlelight flickered, casting shadows that didn't belong to them. The wooden door shuddered under the force of what was outside. The heavy iron latch groaned, the old wood splintering in places as something pushed against it, not slamming, not hitting, but pushing with a terrible, deliberate patience. Jonas stepped back, knife drawn, his mind reeling. The fishermen were deadly still, their eyes staring at the door, as if hoping it would simply cease to exist. Then the whispering began again. Jonas Hale. The voice was thick, wet, and wrong. It slipped through the cracks in the door, swirling around the room like a fog. Jonas gritted his teeth, but his breathing quickened. The way it spoke, it wasn't a scream or a growl. It was intimate, like it had known him for a long, long time. The bartender's face was pale. It never said its name before, he whispered. Jonas turned to him sharply. Have you seen it before? The man did not answer, but his silence spoke volumes. A slow, wet scraping sound was coming from the outside of the door, as if something impossibly tall was sliding its fingers or limbs over the wood. Jonas gripped the knife tighter. This thing was toying with them. Then, without warning, the whisper changed. It no longer said his name. It was laughing, a distorted, choking sound, like something with too many mouths trying to imitate human laughter. And then, it stopped. The air in the tavern grew heavier, as if something invisible had filled the space. Jonas held his breath, waiting, listening. And then, the latch broke. The door swung open with the crack of splintered wood. The lanterns flickered wildly, their light illuminating nothing. Jonas's knife was leveled, his posture steady, but the outside of the dock was empty. A thick fog curled like lazy smoke, rolling toward the water, swallowing up traces of whatever had been there. But it was gone. Jonas exhaled slowly. The fishermen remained frozen, fear etched on their faces. The bartender swallowed hard. It's playing with you, he muttered. Jonas stepped outside, peering into the fog. Empty boats swayed in the slow tide as they stretched out in the black tide. The waves hit the shore, evenly and rhythmically, until something moved beneath them. Jonas saw it. At first it was just a ripple, then another one, shapes changing just below the surface. The water wasn't deep here. Nothing of this size could move so smoothly. And then, something rose. Not completely. Not enough for Jonas to make out its shape. Just enough. Enough for a mouth to tear through the surface. A mouth too wide, too smiling, too hungry. The black tide swallowed him up again before Jonas could react, but something thick and oily slid across the wooden planks of the dock, left behind like a stain. Jonas took a slow step back. Then he heard it. A whisper, but this time in his own head. You're not ready. His stomach turned to ice. And under the waves, the monster laughed again. Jonas stood on the dock, his heart pounding, staring down into the darkness below. The monster spoke in his head. This had never happened before. He had seen monsters, hunted them, killed them. But this was something else. The fishermen behind him were silent, like statues in the doorway of a ruined tavern. The only sound was the slow lapping of the waves against the wooden shore, which now seemed heavier, thicker. Jonas exhaled and forced himself to take a step forward, toward the dock, where a thick, oily stain glistened in the lantern light. He crouched down, holding the tip of his knife out to it. As soon as the steel touched it, the blackness stirred. Jonas recoiled as it squirmed, breaking away from the blade as if it were alive. For a moment, the stain trembled, and then, without warning, it sank into the tree, as if it had never been there. Jonas slowly got up. What the hell is that? He muttered. The bartender was the first to find his voice. We don't say his name. Jonas turned to him. Does he have a name? The man's face was blank, as if he were looking at something far away. His hands shook as he reached for a bottle behind the counter and poured himself a drink with unsteady fingers. Once upon a time, he whispered, before this village was built, there was another settlement here. Fishermen, like us, but they dug too deep. They pulled something out of the ocean that was not supposed to be touched. Jonas's eyes widened. What did they find? The bartender swallowed hard. They couldn't tell me. A cold wind blew through the broken tavern door. Jonas let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. What happens to those who disappear? The bartender shook his head. We don't know. Jonas squeezed the gap. That's not good enough. The man exhaled shakily, running a hand over his face. Those who have been taken, sometimes they come back. Jonas felt something twist in his gut. Come back, how? A pause. Then one of the fishermen finally spoke, his voice a fragile whisper. They're coming out of the ocean. Jonas felt the weight of those words settle into his bones. Show me. The bartender hesitated. The fishermen exchanged anxious glances. Then, without saying a word, the bartender grabbed a lantern and gestured to the door. Jonas followed him out onto the dock, and the rest of the fishermen followed like ghosts. The night was thick with fog that swirled over the wooden planks, absorbing their footprints. The wind had died down. The air seemed too still. The bartender led him past the boats, past the fish-gutted crates and rusty chains, until they reached the edge of the pier. The ocean stretched out before them like a boundless black mouth. Then the bartender pointed. Over there. Jonas followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing. Only water, slow and heavy, reflecting the pale glow of the moon. Then, a figure appeared on the surface. Jonas's breath caught in his throat. A man was coming out of the ocean. His movements were slow, unnatural, as if the sea itself did not want to let him go. Water dripped from his body, but his clothes were dry. His skin was pale, too pale, like someone who had never seen the sun. Jonas felt his stomach twist. The man's eyes, they were wrong. They were black. The man took another step forward, then another one, and as he did, more shapes emerged from the waves. Jonas counted 6. No, 7. All moving with the same eerie slowness. All staring. All wrong. The bartender took a step back. It's them, he whispered. Jonas gripped his knife tighter. Who? The missing, the bartender said, his voice barely audible. It's William Carter. Jonas' eyes darted to the first man who appeared. The name was familiar, his friend, the man who had sent him the letter. The reason Jonas had come, but this thing, it wasn't him. Jonas took a slow step forward, his heart pounding under his ribs. William, he called out, can you hear me? The figure twitched. The others behind it twitched as well, as if they were all connected like puppets on a string. Then they opened their mouths, and the ocean screamed. Not a human scream. Jonas had never heard anything like it before. It was a sound that pierced the air, wet, guttural, and deep. Jonas staggered back. The sound was not coming from their throats. It was coming from within them, from whatever had taken them. Jonas' vision blurred for a moment, and his ears rang with an unnatural scream. When he came to, the figures were closer. Their mouths were still open, but they weren't breathing. They were just waiting. And then, all at once, they stepped forward. Jonas's instincts screamed at him. He didn't hesitate. He ran. The bartender and the fisherman ran after him, their boots clattering on the dock. Jonas did not look back, did not dare. But he heard their footsteps. The steps behind him were not hurried. They were not clumsy. They were precise. And they were getting closer. Jonas reached the tavern when something cold touched his back. He slammed the door. As soon as it closed, the noise stopped. There was silence. Jonas's chest rose and fell with ragged breathing. The fishermen stood in stunned horror, their backs against the wall. The bartender's hands trembled as he grabbed the bottle and smashed it on the floor. His breath came in shaky gasps. We're dead. We're all dead. Jonas turned to the door. Then he heard a whisper on the other side. Soft, gentle, familiar. Jonas. His own voice. Jonas's blood turned to ice. The thing was learning. A whisper, his own voice, slipped through the cracks in the tavern door like an oily tide. Jonas clenched his jaw, his hand tightening on his knife. The fishermen were silent, their breathing shallow, their eyes glued to the door like prey caught in the eye of a hunter. The bartender gripped the bar, his lips moving in a whisper that didn't sound like a prayer. Jonas took a slow step toward the door. Then another one. The whispering stopped. Jonas exhaled, steadying himself. He'd dealt with nightmares before, but this was something different, something deeper, older, something patient. He pressed his palm against the wood, feeling the damp coldness that clung to it. Then, something on the other side moved. Not footsteps, not scratching. It moved, as if the water was trying to remember how to be a body. Jonas took a slow breath. "You took them," he said. "Why?" Silence. Then the whispering returned. Soft, quiet. "They were hungry." Jonas felt goosebumps crawl across his skin. The way he spoke was not just imitation. It was learning. "Who?" he asked. "Who was hungry?" The whisper laughed. A thick, wet, gurgling sound, as if something was drowning and choking at the same time. "Come see." A new sound slipped across the room, a slow, rhythmic tapping on the door. As if with fingertips, Jonas's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned to the others. "We have to go. Now." The bartender stared at him, his face twisted with fear. "There's nowhere to go. He's in the water. He's in the air." Jonas didn't care. He wasn't going to sit here and wait for them to pick him up. He grabbed the lantern off the table and threw it to the floor. The fire instantly burst into flames, orange tongues licking the damp wood. The fishermen gasped. "What the hell are you doing?" One of them wheezed. Jonas's eyes were cold, flushing. The bartender cursed, stumbling as the fire spread. The flames rushed toward the door, black smoke curling up the walls. The wet whispers from outside grew more and more frantic. And then, thud, the door shattered. Jonas grabbed the second lantern and threw it at the wall. More fire, more smoke. The fishermen were coughing now, their eyes wild with fear. And outside, the whispering turned to screaming. Jonas had heard many things in his life, but nothing like this. This was not a person. It wasn't even an animal. It was something oceanic, a sound from somewhere deep, something that never needed lungs to breathe. The door exploded inward, and there it was, a monstrosity of water. It wasn't just one shape, there were many. A moving, writhing black mass that pulsed and folded into itself, like a liquid pretending to be solid. Mouths opened where there shouldn't have been any. Fingers extended from places that were not limbs. And in the center, a face. Jonas's face. Twisted. Smiling. "You're not ready," it whispered. Jonas threw the knife. The blade plunged into the creature's head, but it didn't react. It did not bleed. It just shuddered. And then it rushed forward. Jonas barely managed to dodge as the limb flew past him. The fishermen were not so lucky. One of them screamed as the creature wrapped itself around him, pulling him back. The fire spread. The smoke thickened. The creature groaned not in pain, but in fear. Jonas grabbed the bartender, dragging him toward the back door. "Run!" They ran out into the night, the cold air piercing the smoke. Jonas stumbled toward the pier, his heart pounding. Behind them, the tavern collapsed. The fire roared, consuming the entire building. And in the flames, the creature screamed. Jonas did not stop. He didn't look back. He ran until his lungs burned, until the village was behind him, until the only thing in front of him was the endless black ocean. And then, silence. He turned around. The village was gone. No flames. No ruins. Just nothing. The land where the black hollow had stood was empty. Only wet sand and the whisper of the wind. Jonas's breath caught in his throat. His hands were shaking. And then the water trembled. And from the depths, one pale hand reached up, smiling, waiting. Jonas ran. And behind him the ocean whispered his name.